David Trimble, from Unionist leader to Nobel Peace Prize winner. His legacy will live long in British and Irish history. That's the subject of a new book by Stephen Walker. Stephen Walker has been a familiar face on our television screens, working for years covering Northern Ireland politics. Now he's becoming increasingly familiar on our bookshelves. Following his biography on the former SDLP leader John Hume, the journalist and broadcaster crosses the political spectrum to examine the life of David Trimble. After writing that biography of John Hume, was it inevitable that you would write a book on David Trimble?
Yes, because it became clear to me that there was an awful lot of history and stories surrounding David Trimble that I felt should be put in the public domain. Biographies of David Trimble had been done, but there was a 20-year gap. Those biographies didn't get a chance to look at his move from the Ulster Unionists to the Conservatives. They didn't get a chance to look at his time in the Lords, and obviously they didn't get a chance to look at Brexit. So I thought there was an opportunity to look at David Trimble's legacy. So I spoke to the Trimble family, and they have been very helpful and given a whole series of interviews for this book so that I was able really to trace his life and his legacy.
In your days as a reporter, you had chronicled the many twists and turns of David Trimble's political career. When it came to writing this book, where did you begin?
Well, I suppose, as journalists, when we come to a subject, we have some preconceived ideas, and I had some preconceived ideas of David Trimble because you probably had a similar experience to me. Sometimes interviews with David Trimble could be quite feisty, and he could often challenge you as much as you were challenging him. And he had a reputation in the press, I suppose, as being a bit of a hothead. He was a cartoonist's dream because they portrayed him very often as an angry man. So I had some of those preconceptions. But once I started to talk to people, I realized that he was a very complex man. He showed many emotions. He could be rude, he could be brusque, he could be courageous, he could be visionary, and someone joked, that's just one morning. Seamus Mallon famously said there were 7 David Trimbles, one for every day of the week. And the more that I spoke to his family, the more that I spoke to Lady Trimble and his grown-up children, I got a sense of the David Trimble at home, the private David Trimble that we never saw. So I think I got a sense of the full David Trimble, not just the David Trimble that went into the Commons debating chamber or went into negotiations, but the David Trimble who was on holiday, the David Trimble who was at home, how he relaxed. So I've tried by doing 100 interviews with colleagues, political rivals, diplomats, and friends from our own profession to get their insider's view of him, and hopefully I've been able to present the full picture.
How did you decide who you would go and interview?
Well, the list was long, very, very long. I think the initial list was probably about 150 and 200, but I tried to keep it as close to 100 as possible. There were 100 interviews for the Hume book, so in a sense that was my barrier. And 100 interviews, as you know, Paul, very well, it's a tall order. And that took an enormous amount of time, and there were an enormous number of transcripts. But I think with that figure, I have been able to get to all parts of his life, to all parts of his character, and I've been able to trace it. It's essentially a book that traces from his life to his death.
One of those you talked to was a law student at the time, Mary McAleese, who became Irish president. She has a clear recollection of David Trimble's behaviour on the day after Bloody Sunday.
That's right. She recalls that she went to Queen's with a colleague and she saw David Trimble going up to students, Catholic students, saying, "Isn't this a good morning? Isn't this a good morning?" And she found that odd because David Trimble was quite a reserved figure and wouldn't necessarily have done that kind of thing, wouldn't necessarily have gone out of his way to talk to people, particularly people he didn't know. And it only dawned on her after a little bit of time what exactly was going on, and she makes it quite clear that he was behaving that way in the aftermath of Bloody Sunday, and her comments are very stark. She said he behaved on that day in a sectarian way. She says his remarks she regards as sectarian. She said he made other remarks that were sectarian. But But what is interesting about Mary McAleese is, in a sense, there were two careers in tandem. Obviously, she is at Queen's. She gets a job at Queen's that he went for as well. Then she goes on to be President of Ireland. He goes on to be First Minister. In a sense, it's a plot a bit like from a Geoffrey Archer novel. Here they are, almost first among equals. But her contribution to this book is really important because she traces his development from those early days in the 1970s, when he would have been against the Sunningdale Agreement, to moving into the centre of politics, to ultimately embracing the Good Friday Agreement, becoming First Minister and becoming a Nobel laureate. So Mary McAleese, in that sense, is an essential part of the David Trimble story.
And Mary McAleese has an equally clear recollection of attending the Requiem Mass in Buncrana following the Omagh bomb of 1998, by which time, as we know, she was Irish President.
And that's a pivotal moment. And David Trimble wasn't a touchy-feely person. And they embraced. And she felt that was a pivotal moment. That was a moment where all the pressures of the past, all perhaps the difficulties of the relationship that those two people moved on and passed away. And that really was a pinch point, a moment of enormous sadness. But she said, in terms of her relationship with David Trimble, she saw a very different David Trimble in Buncrana that day.
He must have been almost a broken man, because it was only a few months after the agreement in April of 1998. And he must have wondered, do we have a future here at all?
He wondered that. He was on holiday. The family couldn't be contacted. There were problems getting him back to Northern Ireland because he needed to come back quickly. And his children couldn't understand what was going on. They were very young, but as far as they understood, the troubles were over. They believed that the 1998 agreement meant peace and there would be no more bombs. So yes, and he was very upset, very angry about what had happened, but he knew they had to try and keep the political process together.
I always found David Trimble to be socially awkward, particularly when it came to pressing the flesh on the campaign trail. We now discover that there was a reason for that.
Well, in a conversation that he had with his good friend Ruth Dudley Edwards, and it's quoted in the book, he turned to Ruth Dudley Edwards and said, and I'm paraphrasing slightly, he says, "They're telling me I'm autistic." And there were colleagues who worked with David Trimble, who observed him at close quarters, who believed that he was neurodivergent. That may explain some things. We don't know if that is exactly the case, but certainly he was aware that people were saying this about him, and he discussed it with his friends.
He knew what he was doing in 1998, but not all party members saw it his way. How lonesome must that particular part of the journey have been?
I think at times it was lonesome. I think leadership can be a very lonely business. I think he was disappointed with Jeffrey Donaldson. I thought that he perhaps thought that Jeffrey Donaldson would stay the course. I think he was disappointed that Jeffrey Donaldson and Arlene Foster took the approach that they did to the agreement. Obviously, they had serious problems with the reform of policing. They had problems with decommissioning. They had problems with the prisoners being released. So he was disappointed. He was disappointed with some colleagues. But I think he had looked at the agreement, he'd looked at the balance sheet and thought, it's not perfect. There are problems for unionism here, but we can bank these gains. And there was a strong argument on that day in the unionist meetings that if you reject this and you come back months later, the deal on the table will be worse. And he sized it up, and there was a lot of tension at that time, but he made that call to say, this is the best we can do.
Was the balance sheet thrown into chaos after St Andrews as a result of the agreement there being put on hold almost, or put to one part of it anyway, put to one side? And that was the agreement that he negotiated in 1998.
Well, he always faced pressure. He faced political pressure within his own party, and he faced political pressure from outside the party. And I think if you track the peace process, you can see that there are pinch points within the process where damage is done to the Ulster Unionist Party, and inevitably damage is done to the Trimble leadership. The reform of policing, as I said, caused great problems. Decommissioning caused enormous problems. The release of prisoners caused enormous, and essentially there was a drip effect. And obviously, if you look at the polling at the time, the DUP were chipping away at the Ulster Unionists, and eventually they leapfrogged them. I don't think he thought it would come so soon, but I think certainly at the 2005 election, he knew it was coming.
How important was it for you to seek the counsel of the two political heavyweights of that time, Ken Reid and Stephen Grimison?
Well, it's terrible that we've lost both those men. Both those men were great journalists. I worked with them both, and they broke many stories in their days, and they kept listeners and viewers up to date on a daily basis, and they all had a good insight into what was going on to political events here, and people within the journalistic community in this very building miss both men terribly. I talked to both. I was able to record an interview with Ken Reid, and Ken Reid's interview is in the book. I was in the process of trying to do an interview with Stephen when he fell ill, so I wasn't able to do, but I was able to have a conversation with Stephen about a number of things regarding David Trimble. Obviously, Ken Reid knew David Trimble very well and had an insight into his thinking, and Stephen obviously had two insights. He had the insight at the BBC as political editor, and then essentially he went to work for David Trimble, and so he was able to give me both those insights.
On the 25th anniversary of the agreement, I discovered that it was actually a 50-year plan and that we're only halfway there. So what was his plan? Was it just to wait until people who were in the warring factions eventually died?
David Trimble?
Yes.
Well, I think he realised, possibly early on in his political career, that unionism couldn't run this place on its own. And I think if you can trace his political thinking back to the mid-70s when there was the suggestion of a voluntary coalition. And that caused great angst in the unionist community. It ended up with the Vanguard Party going out of business because it tore the party apart.
And he was a member of Vanguard.
And he was a member of Vanguard, and that was his political journey. I think he realised over a series of years that there would have to be a political accommodation, that unionists would have to share power with nationalists, and then once there was a ceasefire, unionists, nationalists and Republicans would be sharing power. So that was the direction of travel.
When David Trimble retired from public life, the Ulster Unionist Party was deeply divided. But did he leave Northern Ireland in a better place?
I think he did. I think he had a big choice to make in April 1998. I think he realised that if they didn't make that choice then, subsequent choices may not be as good as what was on offer. I think he realised, in his words, this was the best we could do. He felt that local power was being restored to Stormont. He was a very keen devolutionist. He wanted local ministers to be able to make local decisions. He felt the cross-border bodies had been, in his words, watered down, so weren't a threat to the union. He had consent written into it. So he felt there were a lot of gains, and he felt Northern Ireland was in a better place. And then he subsequently moved to the Conservative Party, and after he lost his seat, he was in the House of Lords. And I think privately his hope was that there would be a Conservative administration, and perhaps there might be a ministerial job for him.
How disappointed was he that that did not actually happen?
I think he was privately disappointed, and there are people in the book who were close to him who feel the Conservative Party missed a trick, and who feel a bit let down by the Conservative Party because they feel that David Trimble had the talent and the ability to be a minister. But because of the Conservative Liberal coalition, there weren't enough ministerial posts to be given out.
He said Sir James Craig, the first Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, was a unionist worth celebrating and commemorating. At the end of his leadership, David Trimble was branded a traitor and a Lundy. Yet you contend that he was a significant leader of Ulster unionism.
I think he was. I think he was the most intellectual leader unionism has ever had. I think he was faced with completely different choices that Craig was faced with. I think he was faced with a completely completely difficult, different situation and a harder situation. And remember, Trimble was leading a deeply divided party. And I think one thing that comes over to me from analysing David Trimble's life and legacy is that he was a very able but a very courageous leader.
Enoch Powell said, of all political lives, unless they are cut off in midstream at a happy juncture, they end in failure. Because that is the nature of politics and of human affairs. Can that be said of David Trimble?
Well, I mean, he lost his seat in 2005, but then he went on to the House of Lords. And a lot of people probably don't realise that he was actually a Lord longer than he was an MP. I mean, he became an MP in 1990 and he went on to 2005 and then he went into the House of Lords after that. He was asked about this in a previous interview and he said he thought he lasted longer than he initially thought would happen. So I think he feels he got a good run in terms of being party leader and a good run of being an MP.
A final question, and this is a personal one to you. We know and recognise you from being on the TV. How are you settling into your new role as a writer?
I'm enjoying it. I'm enjoying the freedom, but all the skills that I'd used as a television journalist, I'm still using with the writing. So I'm still interviewing, I'm still talking to people, I'm still hoping that I can continue to write, and I've used all that experience to go into this book.
Stephen Walker, thank you very much indeed. And David Trimble, Peacemaker, is available now.